I always try to, in that sort of scenario, if I'm just going to do something once, then I would probably just do it in Rhino. But if it's the sort of thing where potentially I could be using this tool and making it more complex for the rest of the semester, then I'd put the time in to make a Grasshopper script to do it. The thought there being, if I can spend 30 minutes doing it the Rhino way, I can spend an hour and a half doing it the Grasshopper way, and then never have to do it the Rhino way again. So I mean that, you know, for me it's always about how much time is it going to take to go in versus how much time is it going to save in the long run. So, but yeah, like I said, I really use it more as a tool than as like a tool like a straight edge, or than as a tool like a diagram, like a diagram or a drawing to like explore things.
Do you find yourself sketching out these strings on paper?
Not on paper, but sort of in my head, I guess you could say. I'm kind of, I don't know, I'm a pretty nerdy dude, so stuff, I don't know, it's in my head. I don't know. Did you have a question?
Yeah, can you manipulate poly surfaces with this? Like, play with solids? Can you show how to do that?
Like, what would you want to do to a poly surface?
I don't know.
Isn't
I
it
guess
serious
how
something like a crazy tower that
Right.
abilities?
Yeah, so, here, yeah, we'll make a crazy tower. So, what we're gonna need, we're just gonna make like a circular tower that sort of undulates up and down. Is that what we want to do?
Is that?
Yeah?
I mean, yeah, something like that.
All right. Yep. So essentially what we're going to do is we're just going to create a bunch of circles, we're going to move them vertically, and we're going to lock between them. This, I don't know.
But what about
You mean more like manipulating existing poly surfaces?
Yes.
In my experience, that's actually something that's easier to do in Rhino than in Grasshopper, in the sense that, for me, it always becomes about what sorts of parameters, or like what is your criteria for manipulation. And what I find happens is that if you do it in Grasshopper, it becomes very like numerical, in the sense that, you know, I might specify a 5, which is in a way completely arbitrary, and it has this completely arbitrary effect on the form. As opposed to manipulating it in Rhino, where you may have a little more control over it, or where you may at least be able to manipulate it a little less arbitrarily. So that's, I mean, I guess I generally don't use it to manipulate Rhino geometry in that way. So I'm probably not the best person to answer that question.
Probably if you were doing the sort of thing where you had a lot of sequential deformation of some base geometry.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
The series is a component that you use a lot is really important. Are there any other really key components like that?
I mean, for me, everything sort of comes back to the series and to this range, which will essentially is the same thing as a series, except you provide a domain, in other words, a minimum and a maximum, and the number of steps that you want in between. And I use this, okay, I'll show you an example of how I might use this. So let's say that we have a line. And we want to come up with points on the line, right? Let's just say we want to divide it. So we can use the divide command, and it works well. We can specify the number of points, but the points are always going to be spaced exactly evenly. And so a lot of times you might want to create a little bit more density at one end of points, right? And it might fade off. So one thing that we can do is there's a command called evaluate length. So with this command, you give it a curve, you give it a length, which length along the curve, and then you can specify this toggle. If it's true, then that length is normalized, where 0 is the start point and 1 is the end point, regardless of if the curve is 5 units long or 1,000,000 units long. Does that make sense? If I set this to false, here, let's do this. So we've got the curve, we've got the length parameters, which is 0, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4. Because this is set to true, it's going to evaluate those points against, essentially as a percentage of the total length. If this were set to false, those would be real units, right? So instead of 0.1% of the, or 10% of the length, it's 0.1 units, 0.2, 0.3, so on and so forth. So what I actually like to use this with, in conjunction with, is the graph mapper. So the graph mapper, it's called graph mapper, so the graph type. I always use this Bezier. So basically what it does is you feed in a series of numbers which represent points on the x-axis, and it feeds out a series of numbers based on the y-axis. And it actually works best if you're only operating between 0 and 1. So we can feed in this list of numbers which exist between 0 and 1. And we can feed out that list of numbers which exist between 0 and 1. Right now, we're not actually manipulating the data, but we can begin to use this graph mapper to create a certain amount of density in those points. We could also do this with some sort of like a function, but this sort of technique is something that I use a lot, and it's based around this sort of series or range component. Does that make sense, sort of what that's doing, right? So it's I don't know. And I guess, and otherwise, I use these components just, I mean, as frequently as I might use a Rhino command, I use the equivalent Grasshopper component. So, you know, move, scale, rotate, intersect, all those sorts of things. I mean, you can create geometry, you know, creating circles and squares, creating surfaces, which involves, you know, lofts and sweeps and all those sorts of things. So everything that exists in Rhino exists in here, some form or other.
Do you find a grid tool to use, or grid component to use?
Certainly, if you're talking about, where is it? It's like this one?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're working with a grid, this is a great way to create a grid. I don't know. I mean, I'm not the type that, I don't usually work through grids, but if I did, I would definitely use this component.
Can you step back and explain the difference between the range and series? Like, what would happen if you plugged the series component into the
This graph mapper?
graph? Yeah.
So, if we plug the same series, which is, there's the series 5 1/4, 10 1/2, so on and so forth, it's not really going to work. And the reason why is that if we zoom in, the graph mapper, you have to specify sort of the predicted, or the input range. So it's expecting numbers to come in that are between 0 and 1. So any number that's greater than 1, it's just going to be 1. It's going to sort of truncate the list. So you can specify that manually, right? So we could say that the x values are actually between 0 and 100, right? And then it works, again, based on those inputs. The problem for me is that if I change these numbers, then sort of as I change these numbers, the boundaries of this series are always changing. So I'd always have to come back in here and readjust the bounds of this list, which means it's not sort of as dynamic right? Like, for me, it's always, how can I minimize the number of inputs? How can I let Grasshopper sort of assess those inputs? So one thing that we could do in this case is there's actually this bounds component. So this will give us the bounds of this list, right? So it goes from 0 to 31.5. And then we can remap this list, this series, so that it's still between, basically remap it from this range so that its equivalent range is from 0 to 1. So let me just show you that. So we feed in sort of the values. We're going to feed in the source range, which is the 0 to 31, and the output range is going to be 0 to 1. So I took those numbers, which were between 0 and 32, and I remapped them so that they're between 0 and 1.
So now it's essentially performing the same function as the range.
Right. Which, if these parameters were related to sort of what was happening over here, as we begin to manipulate this data, right, the range is always sort of reacting accordingly.
Can you save this file and
Yes.
email it to us?
Yeah. I'll email it to you,
I'm
Sandra.
sorry to draw these, but my drawings don't match.
Yeah, I'll send this one to you. I'll actually, I made a much cleaner version of this that I'll send that has a few different sort of iterations of the same theme, each getting longer. I'll actually put them on the wiki webpage, and just maybe you can just email a link to that and some other files that will sort of go through that. So again, I mean, I'm sorry that I didn't explain this better. As I would say, as far as learning components, just tinker around with them, and if you can find a way to understand these lists and trees and all that sort of stuff, then it will really be to your advantage. Yeah. And I'm always around, so if you have questions, and I'm not super busy, I'm happy to help. So, sure.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just get all that, John?
Yeah, it's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.